I hope by now most of you know me, but for those who don't, I'm Insa Nolte, and I'm actually no longer the president of the African Studies Association of the UK. We've just had our AGM, and the presidency has passed on to Ambrina Manji. So I'm speaking to you under slightly false pretense, but I'm also liberated from institutional responsibility, which can be a very good thing. So, yes, I want to say, dear colleagues and dear friends, it's lovely to see you here. I've been looking forward to this address for the whole conference, and it's been a great privilege to be part of it, to be part of this conference, to have talked to so many during the conference, and to learn from you. And in fact, many of the things that I've learned from the conversations and interactions during this conference are reflected in my address today. And so please forgive me if I don't mention all the names of those who have contributed to the thoughts I wish to share with you. But you are there, and you will probably recognize yourself if you are there. So I would like to take this opportunity to reflect on two really very different trends that have marked my experience as a scholar of Africa and as a member of the African Studies Association. I do not plan to speak to you as a representative of African studies generally, or as a representative of a UK view that I somehow consider global. I speak to you as a member of the UK Academy, which is very local in many ways, even as it is, of course, part of a wider academic landscape, and as a colleague who reflects and engages with current trends within the UK. Obviously, I also recognize that many of the things I want to speak about hold true for other parts of the world. The first of the two trends I would like to highlight is the expansion of African studies over the past 15 years. I have been a member of the ASA UK during that period, and it is really wonderful to have witnessed the dramatic expansion of African studies in that time. This used to be a relatively small association, and we had conferences that felt almost like family gatherings, which was a wonderful thing in itself, and I hope we have been able to retain a little bit of that. But at the same time, we have been really happy to welcome so many new people who have joined us. And having had over 800 delegates at this conference has been a really new and unique experience, I think, which I think is really wonderful and also shows that African studies is really an area that attracts researchers at the moment. It means that for many of us who work in institutions where research on Africa is still perceived as exotic or marginal, things are changing. While it is important to remain critical of the ways in which Africa has returned to the agenda in the UK, it is reassuring that the world's second largest and second most populous continent is again considered an important topic in UK debate. And Africa matters beyond political and economic concerns. Debates emanating from the continent, such as the #Rhodes Must Fall, incidentally also the topic of this year's winner of the Fage and Oliver Prize, have revived discussions about how to address the domination of European and North American voices in the academy, and how to invite and engage respectfully with those whose voices are marginalized or silenced. By supporting and engaging with such debates, we as Africanists have an opportunity to shape and change public discourse and knowledge production. Equally important for us as scholars is the recognition that the study of Africa often offers insights that challenge established paradigms and disciplinary boundaries. Thus, I think there is a real possibility that a renewed focus on Africa will shape new fields of knowledge, not only by extending or decolonizing established scholarly canons, although that is very important, but also by questioning the assumptions that underlay the production of canonical knowledge. The second trend I want to look at is the fact that the renewed interest in Africa from outside the continent in the UK has not yet led to a more noticeable presence of African voices in academia. Indeed, several commentators have suggested that Africans are often marginalized in the study of their own continent. In a blog post in the African Argument series, supported by our sister organization, the Royal African Society, the Liberian academic and activist Rob Thurnia Paley succinctly summarized this concern by asking, "Where is the African in African studies?" Just to embarrass you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. Her question, "Where is the African in African studies?" is central to our discipline. As Peace Meady noted in a recent contribution to the conversation, it is neither ethically nor academically credible if knowledge about Africa is predominantly produced outside the continent. While she focused primarily on the underrepresentation of African voices in publication, the problem is compounded by the fact that non-white academics still constitute a significant minority in the UK academy, as reported by The Guardian last weekend. If our field of studies in the UK is effectively cut off from African intellectual debate, it cannot make a significant contribution to the continuous critique, reassessment, and reordering of knowledge that constitutes academic scholarship. We therefore find ourselves in a contradictory situation. While knowledge about Africa is increasingly recognized as important, the potential of such knowledge to transform academic debate and practice is potentially undermined by the marginalization of African voices. In this address, I would like to offer you two strands of argument. First, I would like to set out how the current predicament in African studies reflect the wider changes that have transformed higher education in the UK. Over the past 2 decades, there has been a political shift away from knowledge production as a public good. This has been a very complex process, and it has transformed higher education in this country dramatically. One of the side effects of this process, from which I believe we as a field have benefited, is that by reducing the control of those who have historically determined what is the public good, it has created new spaces for the discussion of Africa and for including Africa into our debates. But at the same time, the introduction of market-inspired principles challenges the ability to maintain the long-term academic networks, collaborations, and relationships that are often foundational for truly innovative research. Overall, the growing competition within the sector increases the relative privilege of scholars from wealthy backgrounds and countries vis-à-vis others. The implications of this trend for African studies are significant. Clearly, it is important for us to learn more about the conditions under which African scholars work. There is a desperate need for an African-led debate about education, research, and the university sector in African higher education that takes account of the continent's internal differences and that explores collaborations across such differences and with institutions in different parts of the continent and beyond. It is important that we recognize that this is an extremely diverse space. Even within Africa, it would be absurd to ignore the vast differences between countries such as South Africa and Mozambique, as it would be to overlook those between Senegal and Niger. Clearly, this is a debate in which we must accept the lead of our colleagues from the continent. But at the same time, we know how important it is for academics and intellectuals to engage with basic epistemic questions and to reflect on how the conditions of knowledge production affect the knowledge that is produced. An awareness of the material, political, and other constraints and conditions in which our colleagues on the African continent work is particularly important for those based outside of the continent and those without personal or family ties to Africa. The easiest way for Africanists in the UK to engage with the debates initiated by our African colleagues is to encourage systematic and sustained academic publication and debate on them. It is surprising how few publications on this topic exist in UK-based journals at present. And I am very happy that there are already some plans for opening this new field of publication after the conference. But by that same logic of thinking about the conditions of knowledge production, we must also examine the vantage points from which scholars based at UK universities contribute to debates about the continent intellectually, methodologically, and politically. And that is what I really want to focus on in the rest of my address to you today. In a world which has long been dominated by knowledge produced in Europe and North America, unequal access to material resources is not the only challenge to collaboration. However, the significant disparities between the working conditions of scholars in most African and non-African countries influence opportunities, working conditions, and publishing patterns. We must remain aware of such inequalities in order to consider what forms of collegiality and collaboration are appropriate for our field. And equally, we must invite, hear, support, and engage with the voices of African and Africa-based scholars in order to recognize Africa as a place of significant intellectual production in its own right. I therefore follow my reflections on the state of African studies with a number of suggestions for practical intervention. I draw on many insights and suggestions already made by others in writing at different points, as well as my own experiences, both and my own personal experiences as a member of a collaborative network, research network, partly based at several Nigerian universities, and of course as an ASA UK member, council member, and now past president. Many factors influencing our work in the UK are far beyond our immediate influence, and they reflect administrative and ultimately political considerations outside our narrow remit as scholars. But we have a collective voice in the African Studies Association of the UK and its network of African Studies Associations around the world. The ASA UK has consistently emphasized the importance of active and collegiate relationships between UK and African scholars to its members, to fellow area studies associations in the UK, and to funders and policymakers. I invite you all to support our activities and to join us in determining what other activities we should undertake in order to maintain our field as a viable field. There are also practical measures that we can adopt as individuals to help maintain the integrity of our discipline, and even in our personal research. I'm aware that I will not be able to provide an exhaustive discussion, and that not all the issues I choose to highlight, will be relevant for every part of a highly diverse continent. I therefore offer you my suggestions as part of a work in progress, which brings together some presently disparate sources and reflections, and which provides suggestions and guidance rather than rigid demands. By their very nature, frameworks that enable all scholars of Africa to join in and shape dialogue and debate must remain open and flexible. But the need for these networks themselves is not up for discussion. So, before we discuss African studies in the sense in which it is practiced and understood today, I think it is important to acknowledge, to remind ourselves, that early knowledge about Africa and most of Europe was closely linked to the slave trade and later to the colonial projects of different European countries. While most African countries have been independent for nearly as long as they were colonized, these legacies remain and have left a deep mark. It would be very naive of us to assume that such marks would not periodically or perhaps even permanently resurface in the conversations that we have. However, the production of knowledge about Africa and really the beginning of African studies as a field of scholarly endeavor was transformed by the anticipation of independence in most of Africa following the Second World War. African politicians like Kwame Nkrumah, Nnamdi Azikiwe, and Leopold Senghor rejected the assumptions that undergirded European rule and suggested that the continent's ability to pursue its citizens' economic and political well-being was dependent on self-knowledge. As a part of the world not drawn into the binary politics of the Cold War in the 1950s and 60s, many Africans saw their continent as an alternative to the West. Interdisciplinarity became the intellectual norm in the field in order to address the many questions that arose from the optimism and the ability to engage with Africa. Following a US lead, African Studies Centre were established in several UK universities in the 1960s, and this included what was then the Centre of West African Studies at the University of Birmingham in 1963. Interdisciplinary approaches helped Africanist scholars to challenge a Western intellectual history that either often refused to acknowledge or even explicitly denigrated Africa. Perhaps the most dramatic disputes in the UK involved the discipline of history, where anti-colonial historians like Thomas Hodgkin and Basil Davidson successfully challenged the notion that without documentary evidence in the European mold, African history had to be dismissed. At the same time, nationalist scholars of history emerged in different countries, and African scholars like Kenneth Dike promoted the use of oral evidence and emphasized the importance of Africa's internal dynamics. As a new generation of African scholars built up an expanding and self-confident African university sector, many of those trained in Europe or the US maintained close relationships with their former supervisors, mentors, and colleagues, often based on shared intellectual or theoretical commitments collegial networks emerged across continents, linking up Africanist scholars across the UK, but also including Africa-based scholars with whom they engaged in debate and collaboration. The African Studies Association of the UK was founded in 1963. And a little tide jump here now. By the 1980s, however, the tide had turned. Following the often unrealistic expectations associated with political independence, the realization that former colonies had not recovered, modernized, and overtaken their former colonizers within 2 decades led to a period of perhaps equally unrealistic Afro-pessimism. In seeking to understand the long-term impact of centuries of enslavement and colonization, many contributions initially theorized that it was the structures between global metropoles and peripheries which perpetuated long-term inequalities and disadvantaged African countries. Following the end of the Cold War in the 1990s, political debate and academic interest increasingly focused on the former communist world. Reflecting on the ostensible success of global capitalism, economists and development experts shifted emphasis from the control of market forces to their liberation, and increasingly focused on addressing the apparent failures of African self-reliance. In popular discourse, Africa was increasingly associated with large-scale charity appeals that signaled otherness, but also implied that the continent had little to offer to those who studied it. At the same time, the growing marketization of UK academia, and in particular the introduction of overseas tuition fees, reduced the appeal of the UK to African students. Many African studies centres reinvented themselves, usually by expanding disciplinary undergraduate provision and often through a theoretical focus on development. Perhaps not surprisingly, this was a time when many Africanist scholars moved towards more generalized and comparative approaches, and few younger scholars focused on the continent. But the field survived because, despite many pressures on the growing numbers of despite many pressures on the UK system, the internationalization of academia meant that growing numbers of African academics embarked on careers in the UK or US. Often embedded in research networks with strong roots on the African continents, these scholars helped to normalize the study of Africa in areas where the continent had previously been ignored. In addition, they helped to establish the study of Africa's diasporas as part of African studies. African scholars have also played an increasingly important role in the leadership of the African Studies Association of the UK, and it is thanks to them that the UK continues to punch above its weight when it comes to the study of the continent today. By the early 2000s, the realization that the end of global bilateralism would not automatically produce a more peaceful world has meant that Africa slowly returned to the European and North American academic agenda. In the UK, the expansion of funding aimed at building bilateral relations beyond the EU reinvigorated academic research on Africa. We have already spoken about government initiative in support of the global development goals, but I also want to mention the blossoming of the so-called third wave of African literature, which inspired a re-engagement with Africa in other circles and around literature and popular culture and production. Yet despite the increase in funding, the landscape of collaboration has shifted. In the UK, a focus on research funding through grants rather than posts has privileged academic entrepreneurs over other scholars. The proliferation of fixed-term and part-time contracts often means that colleagues weigh the cost of collegiality and reciprocity against the need to produce the deliverables that will determine their ability to obtain the next grant or part-time contract. As these structural changes contribute to greater precarity within the UK, they often also encourage more hierarchical relationships between junior and senior staff, between European and African staff, and they discourage the emergence of lifelong reciprocal research relationships. These pressures often disadvantage scholars based in African universities by pushing them into roles as research assistants or consultants to ready-made questions and concerns of relevance to funders and intellectuals elsewhere. This often blatantly ignores both the expertise and the needs of African scholars and encourages report writing rather than academic production or publication. Where such divisions of labor have become institutionalized, they impose severe limitations on the conceptualizations and reflections that arise from them. And I would like now to turn to each of these points individually. First, and I think this is perhaps the most important agenda that underlies everything else, is that we must challenge the ostensible divide between empirical and theoretical research. Already more than 10 years ago, Adebayo Olukoshi criticized the growing asymmetries in the relationship between European and African-based researchers. He suggested that Africa-based academics increasingly took on consultancy roles or focused on narrowly empirical research, while, and I quote here, external Africanists assumed the function of interpreting the world to Africa and vice versa. A systematic division between empirical and theoretical academic labor, between African and European researchers, undermines the core principles of the academy, and it diminishes the knowledge it produces. Moreover, it obscures the fact that the distinctions between empirical and theoretical research are themselves part of a hierarchical conception of knowledge. Yet, there are many relatively simple ways in which Africanists in the UK can challenge such divisions of labor in their everyday research practices. Perhaps most importantly, all scholars of Africa must read the work produced by their Africa-based colleagues. Importantly, such textual engagement must be based on close and critical readings, on contextualization, and on understanding, truly understanding where these texts come from and what they engage with. Where texts by African authors appear to have little direct bearing on the theoretical concerns that dominate debate outside of Africa, scholars must resist the temptation to understand them as factual source material. Empirical knowledge does not exist independently of the wider categories in which its producers understand the world. Understanding this, then, it is our responsibility as scholars to interrogate all texts both with regard to their form and content in order to understand the conventions and the debates that shape them. Just as all scholars engage critically with historical or political sources about Africa, reading them against the conventions of their time and place, and within the conventions of their time and place, to understand what they can tell us and what they cannot tell us, they must assess the text, or we must assess the text produced by colleagues in Africa against the context of the wider debates to which they respond. For some of us, that may mean that we have to develop our understanding of the relevant forms and debates in the African countries from which the texts that we read emerge. And finally, of course, we must reference the scholarship by our African colleagues. as Carly Katsia noted earlier this year in a rightly celebrated address to the African Literature Association, bibliographies and citations are a clear and transparent way of showing who is invested in a certain kind of knowledge and in whom we in turn invest. The same logic applies to teaching and to requesting books and access to journals based on the African continent, which encourage and enable our students and colleagues to expand their own reading practices. If our publications, our teachings, and our libraries imply that African academics have not made the most meaningful contributions to the study of a particular field, we need to stop and consider why we think that this field is relevant to the study of Africa. The other imperative that arises from stereotypical divisions of labor is that irrespective of time and other pressures, all scholars must continue to carry out fieldwork in Africa. Fieldwork is not simply a precondition for the production of knowledge. It constitutes a form of knowledge in itself. And if I can interrupt with a small example from my own researcher, I think only somebody who has really worked in the Yoruba part of Nigeria, where greeting is compulsory, and we must kneel down to greet our elders and in turn receive, other greetings by people who kneel down or prostrate for us. Only a researcher who has physically experienced this environment can truly understand the revolutionary potential and the outrage associated with the Muslim and Christian groups that refuse to participate in such practices. It is one thing to read it. It is another word truly to experience the discomfort associated with such situation. Despite the attempts of some ethics committees to limit researchers' exposure to fieldwork, interviews are no substitute for participation, observation, and engagement. Moreover, interview transcripts or survey questionnaires produced by research assistants abstract from the highly specific and relational encounters that enable the sharing of knowledge and confirm what is worth sharing and capturing. Most importantly, however, fieldwork requires researchers to have at least a passing knowledge of African languages and sociolects, including local creoles and pidgins. These languages are home to the conceptual categories in which the groups and individuals at the heart of our research think about the world and their actions and experiences. We need to know how those targeted by our research questions translate and discuss them. The slippage between the relevant local terms and our own preoccupations, usually limited to the main languages of academic production, offers us insights about the objects of our research that are silenced by translation. Often the gaps between our own understandings and those produced in translation will be theoretically productive and suggests ways in which we may need to reframe the ideas and theories that inspired our research. And finally, opening and indeed consciously inviting African contributions to events in and outside of Africa can also help to open up agendas that are potentially defined by interests originating outside of Africa. This is why at this year's ASA UK conference, we decided for the first time explicitly to invite African colleagues to respond to our call for thematic streams, in order to ensure that the different strands of the conference were not unduly biased towards UK research concerns. I believe that the contribution of the African scholars who have co-organized or organized streams at this conference has made the conference what it is. And I look forward to seeing the exciting work that will undoubtedly emerge from the encounters that their work has facilitated. I think we should be grateful to all of them. I know I am. As with research, it matters not only what we publish, but how and where we do so. Again, material and intellectual concerns are closely entwined. Many of the reasons that contribute to the underrepresentation of African scholars in global scholarship reflect the political economies of their respective countries. In many parts of Africa's universities and university libraries are under-resourced, and access to often low bandwidth internet imposes significant costs on online searches and access even to free texts and databases. Moreover, academic research is sometimes consciously limited or appropriated by vested interests, making it difficult or near impossible for scholars to pursue avenues of research interests at particular times and in particular places. But what is important for us and the need to maintain the legitimacy of our field is that since the 1990s, the number of articles published by African authors in the UK and other international journals has declined. It is likely that this reflects the many difficulties faced by scholars in African countries, which often make it harder to bring texts to publications. It is also linked to a growing pressure to publish in countries like the UK. The research assessment exercise and the research excellence framework have encouraged an ongoing increase of UK scholarly output that probably displaces other texts. But most importantly, I think the decline in African publications reflects the fact that scholars based in the UK and elsewhere outside of Africa often have better access to the resources that enable publication. Moreover, as reviewers and editors, they determine what gets published. Recent research by Ryan Briggs and Scott Weathers on publishing in African politics has suggested that research by Africa-based scholars has fallen from about 25% to circa 15% between 1993 and 2013. They also suggests that research by African-based authors tends to be more focused on individual countries and communities, while non-African scholars tend to produce more comparative work and generalize more. We must acknowledge that both approaches are important. While comparative or generalizing approaches may offer larger theoretical insights, they also allow researchers to gloss over a lack of local knowledge and language skills. This is, of course, the classic trade-off in scholarship between breadth and depth. Including larger numbers of African editors and reviewers into the global publishing landscape would be an important step forward. Seeing an African name or affiliation among editors' names would help journals to reach out to Africa-based authors who might not have considered submitting their work there. And this is particularly important, I think, for journals with low numbers of African-authored articles, whose readers may have formed the opinions, rightly or wrongly, that their texts may not be welcome. One way of actively soliciting African contributions is the organization of writing workshops or publishing workshops. Since 2009, the ASA UK has organized such workshops aimed at African authors, usually held in African countries, where scholars work in intensive sessions with editors in order to produce papers that will be ready or near ready for publication. Similar workshops have been organized in the context of the ASA in the USA and in Africa, and of course also by individual Africanist journals. I'm coming back again to Carly Katzir, who has done such sterling work in this field, and she has suggested that including larger numbers of African and African-based editors and reviewers could also help journals to develop reviewing practices that encourage all authors to recognize and address the gaps in their research. The tacit insights that arise from an in-depth understanding of the practices and discourses particular to certain communities or parts of Africa are indispensable, not only because they ensure that theoretical arguments remain grounded, but also because they drive reflection and reassessment. It is therefore important for UK journal editors not only to support authors of single case research studies to draw out the wider implications of such studies, but to interrogate authors of a comparative or generalizing research about the degree to which they have taken conceptual differences between countries or between different linguistic, cultural and historical groups into account. A pro-Africa editorial policy could also include a statement on African languages, another field where non-African researchers often fall short. Equally, a pro-African editorial policy must include more active strategies towards increasing the number of African authors. It may be appropriate for some journals to aim for a minimum quota of African-authored articles, and for others to consider forms of active support that may require funds from publishers. Given that African scholars are often forced to publish in their second or third language, it may be reasonable for journals or publishers to make additional copy editing funds available to authors for whom English is not their first language. More could also be expected of reviewers, and that reviews of African authors that suggest revision could, as a matter of course, include lists for further reading. Revisions would also be much encouraged if authors were provided with the most important text listed for revision, as a matter of course. It would certainly help prospective authors to understand better what was expected if journals and their publishers made their publications freely available to those whose work is under review. The conscious and active inclusion of African authors is not only a concern for editors and reviewers, but also for editors of special issues or edited collections. As Grace Muzilla, our wonderful keynote speaker from the beginning at this conference, noted in a different context, edited volumes on Africa that include none or only one or two African authors should really not be the norm. They should be the exception. On that note, I think it is important to recognize intellectual collaboration and co-publication and to consider it carefully. It seems reasonable to expect that in the context of most collaborative relationships, African authors will also appear as the first named authors, once or twice, or more times. The need for closer collaboration with African authors encourages us to think about the politics of access more generally. It is not acceptable that most research carried out at universities outside of Africa is not easily accessible to scholars and other stakeholders in the countries on which the research focuses. Open access publications can make a difference, but this is often either too expensive or impracticable. Moreover, even the most comprehensive open access policy means little if scholars in the relevant country do not routinely have the internet access they need to benefit from it. A simple and elegant way of ensuring mutual access to literature for those in collaborative networks and projects is for all parties involved to provide for shared access to their library resources, including, where available, low bandwidth online access. Individual researchers can often arrange this through honorary affiliations, but here the onus really is on universities to make online library access available to African collaborators of their staff as a matter of course. This could easily be achieved if funders emphasize the need for such collegiality. Of course, knowledge sharing is not a one-way street, or as Divine Fu from Codestria described it yesterday, a dumping of knowledge. So scholars based outside of Africa must also submit their work to journals and collections published on the African continent and submit to the reviews processes in place. Where such publications are circulated in print form to local libraries and bookshops, during departmental research seminars and during conferences, they can reach significant audiences. Positions as reviewers or editorial board members will also help scholars based in the UK to build closer links to Africanist scholarship on the continent. And I was going to say quite a lot about co-publication, but I actually realized that our own intervention as an association in facilitating easier co-publication of monographs in Africa are still under discussion. So I just want to say that while there are no size-fits-all solutions, I think it is not acceptable for us as scholars to produce work that isn't accessible to our colleagues in the countries where we work. And that is particularly important for monographs, which are often long and sustained pieces of argument. So I do think we should all make it part of our personal publication mission and engagement to raise the possibilities of co-publication in the countries on which our research is based at the very beginning of negotiations with academic publishers. And I point you towards the ASA UK and obviously our website to learn more about the practical suggestions in place about this. And finally, it is important that we encourage universities and funders to invest into UK African networks at graduate level. While it is wonderful to see that the number of graduate scholarships and opportunities specifically reserved for African scholars in the UK has increased in recent years, much remains to be done. In order to encourage a tighter weave in the fabric of the knowledge we produce, or what policymakers call capacity building, we need to encourage graduate exchanges both for Africans in institutions outside the continent and vice versa. Split-site PhD programs or co-supervision arrangements can contribute to the emergence of a new generation of younger scholars whose research networks epitomize the collaborative nature of African studies. In a sector driven strongly by market considerations, such initiatives would require some political and financial commitment on the UK side. Equally, the current practice of attracting African colleagues to UK university for fixed-term teaching posts during their sabbaticals at home must be complemented in other ways. Teaching fellowships, such as those offered regularly by the ASA UK, can enable early career scholars from outside of Africa to gain work experience at an African university and to benefit. As a visiting professor at Adeyemi College of Education in Ondo, Nigeria, I also know that many of us in more established posts in the UK hold honorary or visiting positions in African universities and higher education institutions, where such appointments come with real commitments to graduate and undergraduate teaching or the transformation of programs and administrative practices. They offer unique insights into the debates and conditions that shape academic practice on the continent. But we must also become more mobile professionally in other ways. Many of us have already increased our involvement in workshops and conferences on the African continent. The growing number of excellent events in different parts of Africa suggests that such events are able to attract large and highly diverse audiences of African scholars. While many of us will be aware of our own networks or through our own networks of relevant events, please allow me to suggest to you that you attend the conferences of our sister organization, the African Studies Association of Africa, or ASAA. Founded in 2013, the ASAA is currently led by the formidable Akosua Adumako Ampofu, Professor of African and Gender Studies at the University of Ghana. And the conferences organized by the association offer a supportive atmosphere, interdisciplinarity, and chance to catch up with colleagues around the world, which is also what we've tried to emulate at this conference here. By helping scholars based outside of Africa to experience firsthand the debates that shape their African colleagues' intellectual practices, we are able to think about forms of knowledge productions that really must inform our reading of the literature in our fields. I fear I'm running close to the time I've set to myself, so I want to skip a few points which have to do really with the way in which the equal treatment of all scholars by UK research councils often disadvantages African scholars. For example, the provision that obviously research funds may not be expended on clothing makes sense if academics simply went to, clothes shops and bought themselves ball gowns. However, in the case of African scholars visiting the UK for conferences in November and December, they really do not make sense. So, this is something that needs to be thought out carefully and I think put to research councils and funders in our own personal interactions with such institutions. But I wish to skip this because I want to say a few words on what I think is one of the most important areas of disadvantage, and that has also politicized me rather in the run-up to this conference. And this is that visas are really an area of disadvantage for African scholars in a way that is rather disturbing for those who consider free scholarly exchange a basic consideration or basic concern of our discipline. It is extremely worrying to see the refusal of visas to academic colleagues who have absolutely no intention of staying in this country, who have credible funding arrangements in place, and in many cases, to see that decision-making in relation to visas shows an unacceptable bias. Following our 2016 conference in Cambridge, a Nigerian lawyer explained to us that she was refused a visa on the grounds that her husband would be in the UK at the same time. We cannot accept that visa officers make their judgments based on an academic's marital status and in relation to her husband's travel plans. Such decisions are humiliating and discouraging for African colleagues, who are often planning to travel to the UK at significant expense to themselves and their departments. They are also painfully embarrassing to us, their UK hosts, not least because we are deprived of the possibility of reciprocity, of returning the hospitality we so often enjoy when we visit Africa. By treating African academics as if they were taking away rather than contributing to the UK, the current visa policy also undermines this country's ability to pursue intellectual ambitions and research agendas relevant to Africa. This matter is too important to simply seek relief in voicing our concerns among friends and colleagues or on social media. We must act both as individuals and collectively to call out and challenge such practices. In recent years and months, the awareness of the problems with UK visas has increased across the African studies community. But in order to change things, we must document the systematic nature of deliberate misunderstandings and, frankly, absurd reasonings that sometimes define UK visa practice. And we must explain these and share these with audiences beyond the African studies community. Given that our Prime Minister, Theresa May, has only recently recognised Africa as an increasingly important focus for the UK post-Brexit, I believe the time for this has come. The ASA UK plays an important role, or can play an important role in this process with your support. Since 2016, when visa concerns emerged as a key problem of our otherwise highly successful ASA UK conference in Cambridge, the association has revised and intensified its visa support for African scholars by reporting the GWF numbers of visa applicants to the relevant high commissions and embassies, and especially by following up on visa refusals and personal emails to ambassadors and high commissioners. The conference organizers here for this conference were able to overturn 5 visa refusals, of which we were informed up to 2 weeks before the conference. And I'm particularly pleased also to let you know that the Nigerian colleague I referred to earlier was able to attend this conference without any problems. But, but despite these efforts, I am bitterly disappointed at the number of visa refusals associated with this conference. After the 2016 conference, the association followed up on cases of visa refusal and asked those affected by such decisions to share their experiences with us. Documenting their experiences on our website has allowed us to reach wider audiences through a report in The Guardian and, working closely with the Royal African Society, the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Africa. This time around, we have asked for even more detailed information, and we will invite all of those who have asked us for an invitation letter for their feedback in a post-event visa survey. We plan to use this evidence, and we need this evidence, please. So if you're involved, let us know. In order to produce a detailed report about current visa practice and its impact on African academics, which we intend to share and distribute widely. I invite all of you to support the ASA UK and its activities. International mobility is a key ingredient not only to our discipline, but to research and education in this country and beyond. And we need to devise more convincing ways of making ourselves heard by decision makers and other stakeholders. To conclude, as Africanists, we work in one of the most exciting and intellectually stimulating fields in academia. It is therefore no wonder that our field continues to attract established and early career scholars in many countries outside of Africa, and I hope it will continue to do so. But as our community keeps growing, we need to ensure that we do not lose sight of the practices that constitute us as a community. We cannot exist in any part of the world without the active presence of African scholars and African institutions, just as we need to recognize the debates and practices that shape knowledge production on the African continent as important in their own right. We need to reflect critically on the debates and practices that shape our field in the UK, and that includes our own. While many of the challenges we face extend far beyond our scholarly community, we can make a difference collectively and as individuals in many areas. I have raised a number of points and suggestions, and as is normal in an ongoing conversation, I do not expect all of you to agree with me in every instance. However, I hope you agree that we cannot ignore them.